Will not work then, Signor. He said it is low-grade fuel, and the platform must have high-octane gasoline." Jan threw up his hands and went back into the dome. "I should have known that," he said unhappily. "I would have known if I had thought of it." "What is to be done, then?" asked Sanchez. "There's nothing that can be done," answered Jan. "They may as well put the fuel back in my ground car." Sanchez called orders to the men at the platform. While they worked, Jan stared out at the furiously spinning windmills that dotted Rathole. "There's nothing that can be done," he repeated. "We can't make the trip overland because of the chasm out there in Den Hoorn, and we can't fly the platform because we have no power for it." Windmills. Again Jan could imagine that flat land around them as his native Holland, with the Zuiderzee sparkling to the west, where here the desert stretched under darkening clouds. Jan looked at his watch. A little more than 2 hours before the G-boat's blast-off time, and it couldn't wait for them. It was nearly 8 hours since he had left Oostpoort, and the afternoon was getting noticeably darker. Jan was sorry. He had done his best, but Venus had beaten him. He looked around for Diego. The boy was not in the dome. He was outside, crouched in the lee of the dome, playing with some sticks. Diego must know of his ailment, and why he had to go to Oostpoort. If Jan was any judge of character, Sanchez would have told him that. Whether Diego knew it was life or death matter for him to be aboard the Vanderdecken when it blasted off for Earth, Jan did not know. But the boy was around 8 years old, and he was bright, and he must realize the seriousness involved in the decision to send him all the way to Earth. Jan felt ashamed of his exuberant foolishness, which had led him to spout ancient history and claim descent from William of Orange. It had been a hobby, an artificial topic for conversation that amused him and his companions, a defense against the monotony of Venus that had begun to affect his personality, perhaps a bit more than he realized. He did not dislike Spaniards. He had no reason to dislike them. They were all humans, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Germans, the Americans, and even the Russians, fighting a hostile planet together. He could not understand a word Diego said when the boy spoke to him, but he liked Diego, and he wished desperately he could do something. Outside, the windmills of Rathole spun merrily. There was power, the power that lighted and air-conditioned Rathole, power in the air all around them, if only he could use it. But to turn the platform on its side and let the wind spin the propellers was pointless. He turned to Sanchez. "Ask the men if there are any spare parts for the platform," he said. "Some of those legs it stands on, transmission belts, spare propellers." Sanchez asked. "Yes," he said. "Many spare parts, but no fuel." Jan smiled a tight smile. "Tell them to take the engines out," he said. "Since we have no fuel, we may as well have no engines." Peter Heemskerk stood by the ramp to the stubby G-boat and checked his watch. It was X-15. 15 minutes before blastoff time. Heemskerk wore a spacesuit. Everything was ready, except climbing aboard, closing the airlock, and pressing the firing pin. What on Venus could have happened to Van Artevelde? The last radio message they had received, more than an hour ago, had said he and his patient took off successfully in an aircraft. What sort of aircraft could he be flying that would require an hour to cover 80 kilometers with the wind? Heemskerk could only draw the conclusion that the aircraft had been wrecked somewhere in Den Hoorn. As a matter of fact, he knew that preparations were being made now to send a couple of ground cars out to search for it. This, of course, would be too late to help the patient Van Artevelde was bringing, but Heemskerk had no personal interest in the patient. His worry was all for his friend. The two of them had enjoyed chess and good beer together on the last 3 trips to Venus, and Heemskerk hoped very sincerely that the big blond man wasn't hurt. He glanced at his watch again. X-12. In 2 minutes it would be time for him to walk up the ramp into the G-boat. In 7 minutes the backward count before blastoff would start over the area loudspeakers. Heemskerk shook his head sadly. and Van Artevelde had promised to come back triumphant, with a broom at his masthead. It was a high, thin whine borne on the wind, carrying even through the walls of his space helmet, that attracted Heemskerk's attention and caused him to pause with his foot on the ramp. Around him, the rocket mechanics were staring up at the sky, trying to pinpoint the noise. Heemskerk looked westward. At first he could see nothing, and then there was a moving dot above the mountain against the indigo umbrella of clouds. It grew, it swooped, it approached, and became a strange little flying disc with two people standing on it and something sticking up from its deck in front of them. A broom? No. The platform hovered and began to settle nearby, and there was Van Artevelde, leaning over its rail and fiddling frantically with whatever that was stuck up on it, a weird angled contraption of pipes and belts topped by a whirring blade. A boy stood at his shoulder and tried to help him. As the platform descended to a few meters above the ground, the Dutchman slashed at the contraption. The cut ends of belts whipped out wildly, and the platform slid to the ground with a rush. It hit with a clatter, and its two passengers tumbled prone to the ground. "Jan!" boomed Heemskerk, forcing his voice through the helmet diaphragm and rushing to his friend. "I was afraid you were lost." Jan struggled to his feet and leaned down to help the boy up. "Here's your patient, Peter," he said. "Hope you have a spacesuit his size." "I can find one, and we have to hurry for blastoff. But first, what happened? Even that damn thing ought to get here from Rathole faster than that." "Had no fuel," replied Jan briefly. "My engines were all right, but I had no power to run them. So I had to pull the engines and rig up a power source." Heemskerk stared at the platform. On its railing was rigged a tripod of battered metal pipes, atop which a big four-blade propeller spun slowly in what wind was left after it had come over the western mountain. Over the edges of the platform, running from the two propellers at its base, hung a series of tattered transmission belts. "Power source?" repeated Heemskerk. "That?" "Certainly," replied Jan with dignity. "The power source any good Dutchman turns to in an emergency. A windmill." End of Wind by Charles L. Fontenay.